They said she was cursed, cast out into the snow with nothing but a baby, and a name no one dared speak. But Cora Hawke was never the curse. She was the storm. As the cold bit into her skin, Cora's eyes remained fixed on the distant horizon. She didn't look back at the small, decaying town that had rejected her, though she knew every creaky step, every rusted street corner, every face that had turned away from her in cold judgment. There was nothing left for her there. The snow muffled her steps as she moved forward, her breath rising in white puffs that quickly vanished into the gray evening. Her heart beat heavily in her chest, not just from the cold, but from the deep emptiness inside her. She had walked through worse winters than this, but none as bitter as the one that had grown in her own family. Her family had given her up. Her father had watched, cold-eyed, as she was cast aside for giving birth to a girl, her mother dear, sweet, and silent in her own pain, hadn't said a word, as if the shame of the town had infected her too. And so, Cora had been abandoned. The child she carried in her arms had been her only solace. But now, even that felt like a burden in a world that didn't want her. The deep cuts in her feet barely registered through the haze of her thoughts. There was no room left for pain, only survival. She stopped when she reached the outskirts of town, where the land began to curl up into the endless pine woods. The trees stood like dark sentinels, their branches bare, heavy with snow. Cora knew she would not make it far before night fell, and she could feel the tension creeping into her bones. But she had no other choice. She had been told there was nowhere for her to go, but she refused to believe that. She could endure. The wind shifted, carrying with it something new, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck rise. There, in the shifting shadows between the pines, a figure appeared. He moved slowly, almost silently, on horseback. His silhouette was barely discernible against the darkening sky, and the horse's hooves made no sound in the snow. His eyes locked onto hers in a way that no one had ever looked at her before. No judgment, no pity, no disgust, just a silent understanding that made her freeze in place. Unsure of what this stranger's presence meant, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was an invitation or a warning. Cora's hands tightened around the bundle in her arms, her daughter, now whimpering softly in her sleep. The stranger's gaze didn't waver, and without a word, he dismounted. His movements were fluid, deliberate. His cloak, thick and dark as the night, billowed around him as he approached, each step measured and careful. "Are you lost?" The voice, though deep, carried no threat, only the weight of a question that felt more like an invitation than anything else. Cora didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. Something about the quiet strength in his presence made her feel seen, something she hadn't felt in years. She had no response for him, only a trembling, silent plea in her heart. Without waiting for her response, the stranger knelt in front of her, his gaze softening. "You're cold. You've walked far." She finally spoke, her voice thin and cracked with exhaustion. "I have no place left." Her eyes flickered to the town behind her. "They left me. They left me to die." The man did not react, though there was something in his eyes, something dark and knowing. He reached out slowly, wrapping her in his cloak. It was thick, warm, and surprisingly soft against her frozen skin. For a brief moment, she let herself lean into him, feeling the warmth seep into her limbs. "Not yet," he murmured. And then, without another word, he extended a hand, not in an offer of pity, but in quiet command. His eyes held hers again, and this time. There was no uncertainty in her heart. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. With a trembling hand, she took his, and together they turned away from Shadewood. As they moved toward the shadowy edge of the pine trees, she looked back once, though the town was already disappearing in the storm behind them. The woman they had cast out, rejected for a child she could not bear alone, was leaving, and with her, the town's last shred of righteousness seemed to fade into the snow. Cora's mind raced as they moved deeper into the wilderness. The snow had started to fall heavier now, clinging to the ground and the trees in thick white blankets. The air was frigid, biting, and she could feel the weight of her daughter's tiny body against her chest. She could feel the shift inside her, the tug of something unknown that made her both fearful and hopeful. The man didn't speak as they walked. She could barely see his face, hidden beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. He was a stranger, a warrior, she presumed, though she could not be sure. His every movement was precise, deliberate, as though he knew exactly where he was going. He seemed to know the land, the way the wind shifted, the way the trees bent. She had no idea where they were headed, but she didn't dare ask. She wasn't sure if she wanted to know. She was too tired, too beaten down to care. The land itself seemed vast and unending, and yet, somehow, the air around him seemed to hum with purpose. They reached a clearing just as the last light of day faded behind the hills. He made a small fire, and for the first time in days, Cora felt something other than pain. The fire crackled, sending small sparks into the cold air. She sank to the ground beside him, her body aching as though it had never known rest. Her eyes dropped to her daughter, wrapped tightly in the shawl, and her heart tightened at the thought of the cold world that awaited them. Without a word, the man crouched beside her. He removed his hat and placed it on the ground, revealing a dark braid of hair adorned with small feathers. His face was weathered, lined with age, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. They looked out toward the night, as if seeking something he could not find. "My name is Kai," he said, his voice low but strong, like the hum of the earth beneath them. "Kai Blackfeather." Cora nodded, though she did not speak. She couldn't yet. There were too many questions, too many fears tangled in her mind. But in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt safe. For the first time since her birth. She was not running away from something, but toward something. It was a strange feeling, one that made her feel both vulnerable and alive. As the fire flickered and the cold winds howled through the pines, Cora sat still beside Kai, her thoughts churning. Her past was a broken thing torn apart by her family, by the cruel words of the townsfolk who had judged her without mercy. But in this quiet space, surrounded by the wilderness, Cora realized something that had never crossed her mind before. She didn't need to run anymore. She had nothing left to lose. But as the fire crackled and the night deepened, Cora knew that whatever lay ahead would be far more dangerous than the quiet town she had left behind. And somewhere in the depths of the forest, she could almost hear the sound of hooves. A distant howl broke the stillness of the night, sending a shiver down Cora's spine. Not from wolves. The sound was different. A deeper, more haunting cry. She stiffened, her heart thundering in her chest. Had the town already found her? Was her past catching up to her? Kai, unmoving, stared into the dark woods, His hand rested casually on the hilt of a knife she hadn't noticed before. He didn't react to the sound, but his posture was taut, like a bowstring pulled tight, ready to snap. Cora felt the fear claw at her insides. "Who's out there?" she whispered. Kai's gaze remained fixed on the darkness. "Wait." Cora held her breath, her body frozen in place. Something was coming. She could feel it in the air. The silence of the wilderness seemed to stretch on, thick with anticipation. She wasn't sure if it was the wind, the snow, or the fear that made her feel as if time had slowed down, but every heartbeat felt like an eternity. The howl sounded again, much closer now. Something or someone was coming for them. The fire crackled louder, and for a brief moment, Cora could have sworn she saw the shadows shifting in the distance. Her heart pounded in her chest, the heat of the fire battling against the cold grip of dread in her stomach. The sound of hooves grew louder, the steady rhythm of the horse's gallop cutting through the night air. Cora's breath caught in her throat as a figure emerged from the trees, a rider, silhouetted against the moonlight. Her pulse quickened. The rider was too far away to make out clearly, but Cora knew one thing for sure: this was no savior. The rider was coming for them. For a long moment, they simply stood there, him on his horse, and her, frozen in place. Then, slowly, he brought the horse to a stop, and without a word, dismounted. He was tall, his broad shoulders draped in a thick buffalo hide cloak, the kind that would protect a man from the harshest of winters. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but there was something about his presence that made Cora feel both nervous and safe. His movements were careful, measured. She could hear him breathing, steady and calm, as he stepped closer to her, his eyes, dark as the night around them, locked onto hers once more. He seemed to be waiting for something, as though the very act of speaking would break some fragile thread of connection between them. "You're alone," he finally said, his voice low, carrying the weight of experience. Cora opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She looked down at her daughter, then back at him. Alone. It was a word she had grown all too familiar with, and yet, in his eyes, there was no pity, no scorn, only a quiet recognition. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I've always been alone." The words fell between them, heavy and raw. She had not meant to say it aloud, but something about the man standing before her, the way his presence seemed to fill the space with a quiet strength, made her feel that perhaps it was time to speak her truth. The man nodded, though his face remained unreadable. "The world is not always kind to those who are different," he said softly. "I've learned that too." His eyes softened ever so slightly, though there was a hardness to them that made her feel as though he had lived through things far worse than any town's judgment. Cora swallowed hard, looking away. She wasn't ready for this, not yet. Anyway, she had no desire to relive the town's cruelty, nor the shame she carried like a scar across her soul. She could not bear to speak of the whispers, the harsh words, the rejection. Not yet. She couldn't bear it. The man seemed to sense her discomfort, for he said no more. Instead, he stepped back, his gaze never leaving her. "You are in need of shelter. I take it." He gestured to the snow-covered trees surrounding them, the darkness of the night closing in. "I can offer you that." Cora hesitated. The firelight flickered in her tired eyes as she glanced back toward the forest. She had spent so many years in the shadows, always looking over her shoulder, never able to trust. But this man, This stranger was different. There was something about him that made her heart ache with the possibility of safety, the possibility of not being alone. She nodded, a slow, reluctant gesture. "Yes," she whispered. "I would be grateful." Without another word, he turned and led her toward the trees. As they walked, Cora stayed close behind, her steps slow but steady. She kept her daughter close to her chest, wrapped tightly in the last blanket she owned, the only possession of any worth she had left. The warmth of the fire from behind them began to fade, replaced by the cold, hard silence of the wilderness. But as they walked deeper into the forest, Cora felt a strange kind of peace settle over her, as if the land itself was offering a reprieve, a place of solitude. Yes, but also one of safety. The silence between them was broken not by words, but by the faint snap of a branch in the distance. Kai's eyes narrowed. "We're not alone," he said. She did not feel the need to fill it with words, nor did the man seem to expect it. There was something about the way he carried himself, a quiet strength that made her feel as though he understood, without the need for conversation. He didn't ask her about her past, didn't push her for answers she wasn't ready to give. And for that, she was grateful. As they reached a small clearing, the man paused. Cora glanced around, noticing the small, simple shelter before them, a lean-to made of pine boughs, with a fire pit at the center. The smoke rising from the fire pit smelled of pine wood and earth, a scent that felt both unfamiliar and comforting. This was not what she had imagined somehow. She had expected a larger, more established camp, a place filled with people. But the solitude of this small, humble shelter felt more like a sanctuary than anything else. "This will do for tonight," the man said, his voice quiet. He turned to her then, his gaze unwavering. "You may rest here, but tomorrow, we will need to move on. The storm will come soon, and we cannot stay in one place for long." Cora nodded, her breath visible in the cold air. She felt the weight of the world shift as she sank to her knees beside the fire. Her limbs were heavy with exhaustion, and for the first time in what felt like forever. She let herself relax. She wasn't alone anymore. The man sat beside the fire, not speaking but observing her with an intensity that was both unsettling and calming. She could feel the weight of his attention, but it wasn't invasive. It was more as though he was waiting for her to speak if she so desired. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to say, what she could say, but in that moment, with the crackle of the fire and the cold night surrounding them, she realized that there was no need for words. She had made it out of Shadewood. She had survived the worst of what the town had thrown at her. And now, for the first time, she could let herself breathe. She didn't know where the journey would lead, but in this small moment, she knew that she had made the right choice. And as the firelight danced across their faces, a howl echoed through the night once more, a distant, eerie cry that sent a shiver through Cora's spine. The man did not move, but his expression hardened slightly. He reached for his knife, his hand moving with a fluid precision. His eyes were alert now, scanning the shadows of the trees. Cora's heart leaped in her chest. The howl sounded closer this time, and she could feel the weight of it pressing against her. Was it wolves, or something worse? The man stood, moving silently to the edge of the camp, his gaze sharp, his posture coiled like a spring. Cora could only watch as he readied himself for whatever came next. She had no way of knowing what the night would bring, but she could feel the tension building, like the calm before a storm. Something was coming. As they settle for the night, a distant howl pierces the air, not from wolves, but from something else. A rider, far off in the dark, their silhouette barely visible against the night sky. The future is uncertain, and danger may still be lurking. The wind howled as Cora clung to Kai's back, her daughter bundled tightly in her arms. The night closed in, and with it, the shadows of both the physical wilderness and the emotional wilderness she carried with her. The snow had begun to fall again, heavier now, swirling around them like 1,000 tiny icy needles. Cora could feel the cold seep into her bones, but she refused to show it. Her daughter whimpered softly against her chest, and she pressed her closer, shielding her from the wind. The chill of the night seemed to be wrapping its fingers tighter around them, pulling them further into the wilderness. And yet, despite the biting cold, despite the darkness that closed in on them, there was something inside Cora that stirred an unfamiliar sense of hope. She had walked away from everything she had ever known, but she hadn't been alone in that walk. Kai had led her out of Shadewood, his steady presence guiding her through the storm. She couldn't explain why she trusted him. Why, after everything that had happened, after all the betrayals and heartaches, she felt safe with him. But somehow, she did. The horses' hooves moved steadily beneath them, each step sinking into the deepening snow. The forest around them seemed endless, the trees towering like silent giants in the night. The only sounds were the rhythmic pounding of the horses' hooves, the wind, and the occasional muffled whimper from her daughter. But Cora wasn't looking at the trees or listening to the wind. Her mind wandered, drifting back to the town she had left behind. The faces of the townsfolk had blurred together in her memory, each one a reminder of the rejection she had faced, the looks of pity, the whispered judgments, the cold stares that had followed her every step. She could still hear their voices in her mind, accusing her, blaming her. For a moment, she thought she could feel their eyes on her once more, though she knew they were miles away, buried in the snow-covered ground of Shadewood. But there was one thing she couldn't forget, the child she had carried. Her daughter. The one they had said was the source of all her shame. Cora had fought for her, struggled to bring her into the world, even when the town had told her she was unworthy. And now, as she clung to her baby in the freezing night, she realized that the only thing that truly mattered was the life she was trying to build for them both. "Are we far?" she asked softly, her voice breaking the silence. She hadn't meant to speak, but the words spilled out before she could stop them. Kai's voice came in a low murmur. "Not far. We'll make it to the ridge by dawn." Cora nodded, though she didn't know what awaited them there. She wasn't sure what her next step would be, what kind of future they could hope for. But for the first time, in a long time, she didn't feel as if she were walking into the dark alone. There was something about Kai, something steady and unyielding, that made her believe they might survive this, the storm, the cold, the relentless wilderness they would endure it, together. The journey through the night felt endless. The air grew colder, the wind sharper, and the snow piled up around them in thick drifts. Cora's body ached from the strain, but she held on tight, determined not to falter. Her daughter, though still small and fragile, had become the strength she never knew she had. The thought of her little girl, her name, a whisper in the dark, kept her moving, kept her fighting. Eventually, Kai slowed the horse, urging it to a stop. Cora didn't question it, though she couldn't understand why they had stopped. They were far from shelter, the trees looming like silent sentinels around them. Kai dismounted without a word, his movements fluid and silent as always. He walked to the edge of the clearing, his dark figure cutting through the snow, and Cora remained seated, watching him. She didn't know what he was doing, but she sensed that he had not stopped for rest. His eyes, though hidden beneath the brim of his hat, were scanning the horizon, alert and calculating. A few moments passed before he returned, his expression unreadable. He spoke only one word, his voice steady and calm. "They're coming." Cora's heart stuttered in her chest. The words didn't make sense at first, and she had to swallow the lump in her throat before she could ask. Who? He didn't need to answer. The sound came then, the faint sound of hooves in the distance, growing closer with every passing second, the unmistakable rhythm of a rider approaching. Cora's blood turned cold, and her hands trembled as she clutched her daughter tighter. "The town," she whispered, though she already knew the answer. Kai nodded, his jaw tight. "They won't stop until they find you." Cora's mind raced. She thought of Shadewood, of the sheriff and the preacher who had condemned her. But it was not just them she feared. It was the whole town, the collective anger they had shared, their disdain for her. And now, they were coming. She could feel it in her bones, the weight of their judgment, their anger. She glanced back at Kai, but he was already preparing the horse. His movements were swift and practiced, the sharpness of his eyes never leaving the horizon. He did not show fear, only determination. "We have to go," he said, his voice cutting through her panic. Cora hesitated. They couldn't outrun them. Could they? They had no plan, no shelter, no place to hide. But what other choice did they have? She didn't wait for an answer. She dismounted quickly, her legs shaky from the long ride. She felt the sting of the cold in her legs and feet, but there was no time to think about it. She climbed onto the horse behind Kai, clutching her daughter tightly to her chest. Kai didn't waste time. He urged the horse forward, the animal's hooves pounding against the snow-covered earth. Cora could hear the riders behind them, getting closer, their voices muffled by the wind. But the sound of the galloping hooves was unmistakable. They were coming for her, coming for them. And there was no escape. The forest around them blurred as they moved faster, the trees whipping past in a haze of white. Cora's breath came in short, sharp bursts as the cold air rushed past her face. The snow was deep now, making the journey treacherous. But Kai pushed forward, his focus unbroken. Every step he took was calculated, each turn precise as he led them deeper into the wilderness. The sound of the riders grew louder, the gap closing with every second. Cora's heart pounded in her chest, the fear threatening to overwhelm her. She could hear their voices now, calling out, shouting her name, demanding that she stop. But there was no stopping, not now. Kai pushed the horse harder, urging it forward. The snow was thick, and the trail was growing more difficult to navigate. The wind howled around them, but all Cora could focus on was the sound of the riders drawing nearer. Just as the riders broke through the trees, one of them shouted, his voice high and angry, "There she is! Don't let her get away." The moment felt suspended in time, the world around them slowing, and then without warning, Kai turned sharply, veering the horse off the path and into the dense trees. Cora's body lurched with the sudden motion, and for a brief moment, she feared they would fall. But Kai's grip on the reins tightened, and they veered through the snow, racing deeper into the wilderness. Cora's heart raced as they cut through the forest. The riders still behind them, their shouts echoing through the trees. She could hear the hooves pounding, could feel the tension in the air as they pushed forward. But she knew this wouldn't last. They were running out of time. As they raced through the snow, the riders closing in fast. Kai turned once more, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of something ahead. A shadow, barely visible in the night. A flicker of movement. Something or someone was waiting for them in the darkness. The dawn broke with a chill, the first light creeping through the trees. Cora awoke to the sound of birds singing, a stark contrast to the harsh winds of Shadewood. In the quiet of the wilderness, she realized she was no longer running from something, but toward something new. The night had passed in a blur of motion and fear. Kai had led them deep into the heart of the forest, his horse moving swiftly through the snow as if it knew the land better than either of them. Cora's mind was a fog of panic and exhaustion, her body aching with the constant strain. But now, as the first rays of morning touched the frozen ground, she found herself standing at the edge of a new world, one where the past could not follow. Cora's eyes opened slowly, blinking against the morning light. She was lying in the softest bed of pine needles she had ever felt, her daughter wrapped tightly in her arms, still sleeping soundly. The small shelter Kai had built was simple, but sturdy. The fire still burning low at the center of their camp. The warmth from the flames seeped into her chilled skin, offering a fleeting comfort against the cold that had gripped her for so long. The world around her was still, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. There were no angry voices, no cruel judgments. The air was filled only with the sound of nature, the soft chirp of birds, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the crackle of the fire. It was the silence she had longed for, the peace she had never known, and for the first time in years, she could almost forget the weight of the past that had clung to her like a shadow. But as she lay there, the weight of her thoughts returned, pressing against her chest. She could not simply ignore what had happened, no matter how peaceful the forest seemed. She had run. Yes. But what would she do now? Where would she go from here? The world beyond the trees still seemed as vast and uncertain as the wilderness itself. There was no clear path ahead, no promises, no safety. Kai stirred beside the fire, his eyes flicking open as he heard her movements. He didn't speak at first, simply rose to his feet with the ease of someone used to the wilderness, his dark eyes scanning the camp before he turned toward her. "It's quiet," Cora said softly, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or to herself. She had expected the wilderness to feel more oppressive, more isolating. But here, it felt freeing. Kai nodded, his face unreadable as ever. "It's always quiet before the storm," he said, his voice steady. "We've outrun Shadewood, but we haven't outrun the world. You know that. Don't you?" Cora's throat tightened at his words. She nodded, her eyes dropping to her daughter's tiny face. The storm was coming. She knew it, no matter how far they ran, no matter how much they tried to escape. The world would always catch up with them. And what would they do when it did? She didn't answer right away, not trusting her voice to hold steady. But Kai didn't push her. Instead, he began to prepare the camp, his movements smooth and purposeful. There was something about the way he worked, a quiet confidence that made her feel safer than she ever had before. After a moment, He spoke again, his tone softer this time. "You're not alone anymore. Cora, the world may be cold, but we're not. Not while we're together." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, as if they carried a weight of their own. Cora wanted to believe him, wanted to feel the truth of his words. But the fear that had been a constant companion for so long was not so easily cast aside. She pushed herself to her feet, carefully adjusting her daughter in her arms. Her body protested the movement, aching from the cold and exhaustion. But she didn't let herself falter. She had to be strong. She had to be the mother her daughter deserved, even if she didn't always feel capable of it. Kai glanced at her, his eyes steady and patient. "I'll go ahead. Make sure the path's clear. You rest. We'll leave at midday." Cora nodded, though she didn't trust herself to speak. She watched him move into the trees, his dark figure swallowed by the shadows of the pines. As soon as he was gone, Cora sank down beside the fire again, her thoughts tumbling over each other in a chaotic mess. She had no idea what the future held, no idea if this new life she was trying to build would last. But in the quiet of the forest, there was a part of her that believed it was possible, and that was enough for now. She glanced down at her daughter, whose soft breathing steadied the erratic rhythm of her own heart. Lyra. The name felt like a promise, her mother's promise to give her a future. No matter the odds, she had survived for her, and that would have to be enough. As the morning wore on, the silence deepened. The forest seemed to close around her, the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves blending together into a soft hum. She found herself at peace for the first time in what felt like an eternity. There was no need to look over her shoulder, no fear of the townspeople's whispers. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a life beyond survival. But even in this quiet space, Cora could not ignore the harsh reality of what awaited them. The world beyond the forest still loomed large, full of dangers and uncertainties. She would not be able to outrun her past forever. And though the forest had given her a moment of respite, she knew it was only temporary. The sound of hooves interrupted her thoughts, the rhythmic pounding growing louder with each passing moment. Her heart skipped in her chest, her body tensing instinctively. She hadn't expected it to come so soon, hadn't expected it at all. The horse appeared through the trees, its rider cloaked in the same darkness that had consumed the wilderness the night before. Cora's breath caught in her throat as she tried to steady herself. The rider wasn't one of the townspeople, but that did little to ease her fear. There was something about the way he rode, the way he moved, that felt wrong. She rose quickly, moving to shield her daughter from view. Kai had warned her, and she had been too slow to recognize the danger. The rider's presence felt like a storm waiting to break. The man rode closer, his silhouette growing clearer in the morning light. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but Cora could see the outline of his body, his posture stiff, controlled. He stopped just a few feet away, the horse's hooves sinking into the snow as he dismounted. Cora's hand instinctively went to the knife at her side, the cold metal reassuring against her palm. She wasn't sure what this man wanted, but she knew one thing she couldn't afford to be caught off guard. He spoke, his voice low and calm, carrying a chill that matched the wind. "You shouldn't be out here. It's not safe." Cora's breath caught in her throat as she stepped back, her body tense. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, watching her, his eyes sharp and calculating. She couldn't see much of his face, but there was something in the way he held himself, something dangerous, something that made her instincts scream at her to run. "I said it's not safe." His tone was matter-of-fact, as though he already knew everything about her. Before Cora could respond, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees. The man's hand moved swiftly to his side, and Cora's heart raced as she realized he wasn't alone. Another rider appeared in the distance, emerging from the shadows of the trees. The moment of peace was over. The rider's figure loomed in the distance, moving closer with every passing hour. Cora's heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time since she had left Shadewood. Fear gripped her. She could feel the weight of the past closing in. The wind had picked up overnight, stirring the trees with a sharp, biting cold that cut through even the thickest layers of clothing. The small camp they had made in the clearing felt suddenly more exposed than it had the night before. Cora could see the shadow of the rider approaching in the distance, his silhouette barely visible against the gray morning light. Her hand tightened around the hilt of the knife at her side, her mind racing. She didn't know who he was, but she knew one thing: he wasn't someone who had come to offer help. She could feel it in her bones. Kai had gone ahead to scout, as he always did, leaving Cora alone with her thoughts and the ever-present weight of her past. It was something she couldn't escape, no matter how far she ran, no matter how many miles they put between themselves and Shadewood. It would always follow her. The faces of the townspeople, the judgment in their eyes, the cruel words they had spoken when they had cast her out, it was all still there, lingering at the edges of her memory. The howl of the wind through the pines felt like an omen. She had fled to the wilderness, hoping for peace, hoping for a future that could be different. But deep down, Cora knew that there was no escaping her past. It would always find its way to her. As the rider drew nearer, she could feel the air thickening around her, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The familiar weight of dread settled into her chest, but she refused to let it show. She couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. Not when they were so close to what she had always dreamed of. She had made a choice to protect her daughter, to fight for a life away from the cruelty of Shadewood, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. The rider's figure emerged from the trees, his horse moving steadily toward her, its hooves muffled by the snow. He was a tall man, his coat and hat dark against the pale landscape. His face, however, was hidden beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, his features obscured. She could hear the soft clink of metal as he dismounted, his boots crunching against the snow as he took a few steps forward. Her heart beat faster. She had seen this man before. She had seen his face in the shadows of the town. His name was Caleb Harper. The memory surged forward with a force that took her breath away. He had been one of the men who had shouted the loudest when they had condemned her. He had spat on the ground and called her a disgrace. He had been one of the ones who had called for her to be driven out, as though she were no better than an animal. She could feel the anger rising in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She had no place for it anymore. Not here. Not in this place where everything had to change. She had a daughter to protect. But that didn't mean she was going to let Caleb Harper stand over her. Pretending like the past didn't matter. He stopped a few paces away from her, his eyes still hidden in shadow. "I've been looking for you," he said, his voice low and controlled, but there was an edge to it. Cora's breath caught in her chest. She didn't trust him, didn't believe the words that were coming out of his mouth. She wasn't sure if he was here to harm her or to try and take her back to Shadewood, but she wasn't going to let him do either. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her. Caleb took a step forward, and though he didn't raise his voice, the menace in his words was unmistakable. "You don't belong out here. Cora, the town's got its rules, and you've broken them. You can't just run off into the wilderness like some wild animal. We don't forget what you did." Cora's eyes narrowed. "You didn't forget." "But I did," she said, her voice sharp. "I've left that place behind. Caleb, I'm not going back." He took another step, closer now. She could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on her, but she held her ground. "The town's got its reasons," he said, his voice almost pleading. "You don't understand. They just wanted to keep things in order. And when a woman like you—" "A woman like me," Cora interrupted, her tone cold. "What does that mean?" "Caleb, because I had a child, because I wasn't good enough for your precious town, I'm not your charity case. I'm not some prize to be taken back when you decide I've learned my lesson." He hesitated for a moment, his hand twitching near his side, as if readying himself for a fight. But Cora stood firm, her hand gripping the knife at her side. She wasn't afraid of him anymore, not of his words, not of the shadows of the past. "We're not going back to Shadewood," she said quietly. "Not for you, not for anyone." But as she turned away, she didn't see the shadow that moved behind the trees, watching, waiting. Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Cora thought he might strike out at her. But instead, he stepped back, his eyes hardening. "You'll regret this," he muttered, his voice low. "One way or another. You'll regret leaving. The town will come after you. They'll make you pay." Cora didn't flinch. "I've paid enough," she said firmly, "and I won't be made to pay again. You can leave now. Caleb, or you can keep trying to chase ghosts." For a moment, Caleb just stood there, watching her with eyes full of resentment and frustration. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked back to his horse. He mounted it swiftly, his movements sharp and deliberate. He didn't look back as he rode off into the distance, his form disappearing into the trees. Cora stood frozen for a moment longer, the silence of the forest pressing in around her. She hadn't expected him to leave so easily, hadn't thought he would simply walk away. But then, she remembered that the battle for her freedom wasn't over yet. Caleb was just a small part of the war that raged inside her, between what had been and what could be. And now, she could see that the town Shadewood was never going to let her go. She turned toward the fire, her daughter still nestled in her arms, her tiny breath steady and peaceful. They couldn't stay here forever, not while the shadow of the past loomed over them, but for now. Cora was grateful for the moment of quiet. It wouldn't last, but it was enough to remind her that there was still time to fight. As she settled beside the fire, the air grew still, the forest quiet again. But then, just as the last of the tension left her shoulders, she heard a faint rustling from the trees, not from a bird or a breeze, but from something else, something watching them from the shadows. The feeling of being hunted lingered in the air, and Cora knew that they were not alone. Caleb's hand moved toward his belt, the gleam of cold metal catching Cora's eye, and then came the sound. One shot. Clean. Final. The man from Shadewood lay motionless in the snow, blood staining the ground beneath him. Cora stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. Was this the price of her freedom, the price of peace? The light filtering through the pine trees did little to soften the horror of what had just occurred. The snow that had once looked clean and endless now bore the stain of truth, red and raw and final. Caleb Harper's body lay twisted where it had fallen, steam rising faintly from the wound in his chest. His eyes, once filled with rage and righteousness, were now empty. Cora stood just feet away, her baby clutched to her chest, her legs trembling beneath her weight. She hadn't pulled the trigger. But that didn't seem to matter. It had been Kai, silent, unwavering Kai, who had stepped from the trees in the instant before Caleb had reached for his revolver. His shot had been clean, practiced, and without hesitation. Caleb hadn't even had time to cry out. One breath he had been shouting. The next, he was gone. Kai hadn't said a word since. He crouched a few paces away, his rifle set carefully to the side, his eyes scanning the trees for signs of more. But there was nothing. No more riders, no more voices, just the stillness, the snow, and the thudding in Cora's chest that would not slow. She fell to her knees without thinking. Not out of grief for Caleb, she couldn't mourn a man who had hunted her like a dog, but because the weight of it all had finally become too much. Her body was still recovering from childbirth, her soul still mending from the wounds left by shadewood. And now here, in the hush of morning, blood had been spilled again. The forest, once a sanctuary, now echoed with the consequences of her defiance. "I didn't want this," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant for Kai to hear. He rose slowly, walked over to her, and knelt beside her, without a word. The heat of his presence was grounding. He didn't try to comfort her with platitudes. He didn't offer false assurances. He simply placed a steady hand on her shoulder and said, "It was never going to end quiet." Cora turned her head and met his eyes. They weren't cold. They weren't angry. They just held the truth, the kind of truth carved by years of surviving the unforgiving land. She nodded slowly, understanding at last that freedom wasn't handed out by men in towns or earned through quiet submission. It had to be taken, and it always came with a cost. They buried Caleb that afternoon beneath a thick stand of evergreens where the snow was deepest, not because he deserved their kindness, but because death demanded dignity, no matter who it claimed. Kai dug in silence, his breath fogging the air, the rhythm of his work as precise as everything he did. Cora stood nearby, Lyra bundled tightly against her chest, her eyes never leaving the shallow grave. She wasn't sure if she felt guilt or relief, perhaps it was both. Perhaps it always would be. By sundown. The grave was covered, the ground smoothed as if Caleb had never come. But Cora knew better. The memory of his final words, the venom in his voice, would stay with her longer than the scar in the snow. They didn't light a fire that night. Kai said it was safer that way. Cora agreed. They sat in the shelter, the cold creeping in from the corners, and spoke little. Lyra slept between them, and Cora found herself staring into the darkness, not out of fear, but of thought. She remembered the letter that had once been nailed to her door in Shadewood Leave by sundown, or be taken. It had been scrawled in a shaky hand, barely legible. She had kept it for weeks afterward, tucked into a folded apron pocket, as proof that she hadn't imagined it all, that the exile had been real, that the hate had been real. Now, she realized. She didn't need the letter anymore. The blood in the snow said enough. Kai eventually spoke. "We need to move. Farther north, away from the town's riders, away from the trails." Cora turned to him. "Will it matter?" "It will," he said, with that same calm certainty. "Out there, they write their laws in smoke and fire. But here," he tapped his chest lightly, "we write our own." She didn't answer, but her eyes shimmered in the darkness. She reached down and brushed a stray lock of hair from Lyra's face. The child shifted in her sleep, murmuring, "Safe for now." Cora leaned down and kissed her forehead. That night, she dreamed of her mother, not as the broken woman Shadewood had silenced, but strong and laughing, kneeling in the garden behind their old house, hands stained with earth and lavender, in the dream. Her mother looked up and smiled, not in sorrow, but in pride. They left before sunrise. Kai led the way through the narrow pass between two ridges, the landscape growing wilder with every mile. The trees were thicker, the air colder. No more signs of riders, no more footprints in the snow, but their own. After a few days, they came upon an old, long-forgotten cabin, tucked into a hollow where the trees bent low and the wind passed high above. The roof sagged in the middle, and the chimney leaned like a tired man. But the walls held. Cora ran her fingers along the rough-hewn wood, feeling the stories buried in the grain. "This it?" she asked, almost afraid to hope. Kai nodded. "If we want it." Cora turned, taking in the land around them. A frozen creek trickled nearby, and a ring of stones hinted at an old fire pit. There was space. Space to breathe. Space to begin. She set Lyra down and stepped back, letting the child wobble forward, her little legs sinking in the snow, her giggles soft and uncertain. It wasn't home yet, but it could be. Kai unpacked the saddlebags, his movement slower now, less urgent. There was no immediate threat, no chase, just the quiet work of beginning again. Cora helped him clear the doorway, and they stepped inside together, the air within musty, but still dry. That night, she found something folded in the shadows, a child's toy horse, carved long ago. Someone had lived here. Someone might return. She didn't know who had left it, or how long it had waited there. But she wrapped it around herself and Lyra like a benediction. The fire crackled to life in the hearth, and the smell of burning cedar filled the air. Kai sat nearby, whittling a piece of wood, and Cora watched as the shape of a horse began to emerge under his careful hands. He didn't look up as he worked, but there was a quiet contentment in the way he moved, like a man who had finally stopped running. Cora sat at the window, her fingers tracing the frost, watching the moon rise over the ridge. She didn't cry. She didn't whisper prayers to gods she no longer believed in. But in the stillness, she felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but peace. As they prepared to leave the camp, Cora hears the distant sound of horses approaching. It's the sheriff's men. This time, they will not back down without a fight. And this time, Cora didn't plan to run. Some stories don't leave, they settle in your bones like mountain cold, like the echo of wind through broken chapel doors. And this one, I reckon, will linger with you for a long while yet. You can almost still hear the soft snort of a tired horse in the dusk. The creak of a weathered saddle hanging in the barn, that time forgot. The rustle of dry wildflowers pressed between pages of a journal no one ever meant to read, but someone needed to write. And somewhere in the hush between twilight and nightfall, You might still catch the sound of footsteps through snow, not running anymore, just walking steady, honest, and free. There's something in the way the smoke from a small fire twists up into the cold sky that reminds you of her. Of Cora Hawke, not as the outcast they once called her, but as the woman who endured the storm and carried her child through it. And when you think of her now, don't think only of the blood in the snow or the grave beneath the pines, but of the soft thud of a child's feet across a wooden floor, of a carved wooden horse smoothed by love-worn hands, of a name whispered not in fear, but in prayer. Honor can be buried for a time beneath lies, beneath shame, beneath what men call law. But it ain't erased, not truly, because the land remembers, the wind remembers, and hearts that still beat true will feel its rhythm again if they listen long enough. Justice, they say, comes late. But maybe justice doesn't wear a badge or ride into town with trumpets. Maybe it looks like a quiet man with a steady hand, like a mother refusing to bow, like a child who grows up not knowing fear in her own name. And maybe justice is not loud, because truth doesn't always shout. It just endures, like the frost on cabin windows or the scent of lavender on an old quilt. If you remember anything from this tale, let it be this: Cora wasn't a curse. No matter what they called her, she was someone's miracle, someone's anchor, someone's hope. And maybe that's enough to change the world, even if the world never stops to thank her for it. There are folks who build with stone and steel, and then there are those who build with silence, with grace, with quiet love so fierce it could tame fire. And it's those people, the forgotten ones, the judged ones, the ones who just kept going, who hold up the corners of the sky when it wants to fall, in the end. She didn't need a preacher's blessing or a town's apology. She just needed one man to see her, one child to need her, and a place where her name wasn't a sentence, but a story. And that's the kind of thing you don't forget, even if you never meet her, and if tonight, under your own stars, you feel something stir a memory, a longing, maybe even a kind of ache. Let it stay with you a little longer. Because some truths are best carried quiet. The way the moon carries secrets for the earth, or the way old letters sleep in drawers until someone dares to read them again. This tale wasn't told to glorify blood or bitterness, but to show that sometimes the gentlest people live through the harshest storms, and still find a way to bring spring with them when they rise again. So if you still believe in grace without asking, in strength without shouting, in second chances born from silence, type 1 in the comments, and know you're not alone out here in the dark. This world's full of noise. But somewhere out there, someone is still listening for stories like this one. Stories that hum like a lullaby from the past. Low and rough-edged, meant to be told beside a fire, under starlight, with hands resting on old books and tired hearts. And if this story settled something in you, if it felt like wind blowing through a place you'd long boarded shut, then follow the trail a little further and let your soul sign its name beneath this one. Subscribe to Westwind Whispers, where every story remembers what the world forgets, and where every forgotten woman, every silent man, every child once cast aside, still has a place at the fire, waiting to be remembered.